Oi, pessoal, tudo bem? Hoje a gente está com a Sara, representando a University Cork
Olá.
da Irlanda, e o professor Harrison, que vai dar uma aula incrível sobre o uso da água e a engenharia em todo esse sistema. E é isso aí, pessoal. Fiquem até o fim, que tem um recadinho para vocês depois, viu? Your turn, professor.
Okay, I shall share my screen and I shall start. Okay,
Yes, please.
very good. I'm going to share my screen now. And Marina, could you tell me if you see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Very good.
Yes.
And
yes.
okay, very good. And you can see that now, yes?
If you want
No,
to go
I
into,
think what
if
I
you want
might-
to go into, if we want to go into full screen there, Professor Harrison, we're seeing the presenter version.
Yes, correct. Now I'm going to stop sharing now for you. Okay, we'll start again.
Okay. While you're doing that, I'll
Okay,
just say
this
hi
should be
to you as
better.
well. Olá,
Yeah.
gente, tudo bem? Eu sou a Sara, eu sou irlandesa, morando aqui no Brasil há muitos anos. Eu represento a University College Cork, que é uma das melhores universidades na Irlanda, na segunda maior cidade. Eu só quis dar um oi rapidinho. Aí agora eu vou passar para o professor Harrison para falar sobre água e sobre essa área de carreira que tem muita oportunidade indo para frente, tá? Thanks, Simon.
Thank you. Okay, you can see my screen?
Yes, thank you, yeah.
Very good. Okay, so good evening or good morning in Brazil. My name is Dr. Simon Harrison. I'm not yet professor, perhaps, but I'd like to give you a talk on the global water crisis. So I want to start with, if my machine works, I think it does. Now, how do I go forward? Let me see now. This should work. There we are, at last. I'm living in Ireland, and you may know that Ireland gets lots of rain. Ireland has abundant water resources, allowing it to be a major exporter of water-demanding food. So one of our major exporting industries is dairy. And the reason why we have lots of dairy cows is because we have lots of grass and lots of rainfall. So we are very lucky in Ireland to have this. But other countries are not so lucky. And much of the world is what we call dry land, where low rainfall and high temperatures imposes severe constraints on farming, such as in the paper here. And dry lands are found all over the globe and comprise astonishingly 41% of the global land area. So there you can see on the map the world's dry lands. The red is for hyper-arid, that is extreme desert. The different colors are different severities of dry land. So even though they're very dry and there's not much food, they have a very high population, and the total human population is thought to be something like 2.1 billion. So a lot of people live in these lands. This just shows a table here, a figure showing per capita renewable freshwater resources, and the data is a few years ago. And you can see South America, where you are, we have abundant water as a continent per capita, per person. And that is the most in the world. But if you look at the bottom of the screen, you see East Asia, the Middle East, and South Asia, and Northern Africa. And these are dry land areas, very arid areas with a high and a growing population. So even though they're very dry, they don't have much food, the populations are growing. Unfortunately, most of the dryland countries around the globe are consuming more of their freshwater resources than can be readily replaced due to three factors. Firstly, over-abstraction from rivers and groundwaters. And you can see here a well that is abstracting water from the ground. Secondly, there is increasing consumption per capita. That is to say, as these countries get wealthier, the same number of people consume more water per person in things like washing machines or cars or industry. And thirdly, of course, populations, as I've said, are rapidly. the increase in global consumption, in fact, more than double the rate of population growth. So even though we know populations are growing, the rate of global water consumption is more than double the growth. And 69% of global freshwater withdrawal is in these arid or semi-arid regions. Okay, so we're consuming more and more water, and much of it for irrigation. So renewable freshwater resources by another figure here, and shows that Brazil is that has the amount of water in the world per head of population, but over time this is going down because of the growth of populations. Brazil is still very lucky, but many other parts of the world are not so lucky. They are now severely water stressed. And this shows a figure showing of water stress per country in 29 globally. And you can notice Middle East, that is India, Pakistan, Iran, and Saudi Arabia and North Africa, particularly water stressed. But also notice that Mexico is as well. So it's a big global problem. And this is data taken from the United Nations earlier in the year, where the United Nations is saying that 2.3 billion people live in water-stressed countries, of which 733 million live in very high water-stressed countries. To the point where the United Nations estimates that 700 million people worldwide could be displaced by intense water scarcity by 2030. So in 8 years' time, it is possible that up to 700 million people could be forced from the land where they're living somewhere else because of lack of water and lack of food. And that global movement of peoples is going to create severe global stress. In fact, nearly half the global population are already living in potential water scarce areas where there's water scarcity at least 1 month a year. So half the global population has water scarcity for at least a month a year. And this could increase to something like 4.8 to 5.7 billion in 2050. And most of these people live in Asia. So it's a big and a growing problem. And this is a rather interesting little figure. It shows the global risk landscape in 2020. And I'll just explain the figure for you. Along the bottom of the figure, you have likelihood. That is to say, how likely is the event to occur? And up the side, we have the impact of the event. I'm going to put my glasses on to see this. And I've circled two things. I've circled the water crisis in red, and you can see on the figure, it has high likelihood and high impact. But perhaps we could even rethink this figure. I would think that water crisis, given the scale of the problem, should perhaps be further to the right and further to the top. Climate action and extreme weather and biodiversity loss, of course, are all very important. But I would think that water crisis is now the biggest problem. Interestingly, you can see I've circled in yellow infectious diseases, where it was thought, yes, it would have a high impact, but a low likelihood. And of course, this figure was constructed before COVID. So these things can be easily got wrong. But anyway, I think water crisis is more important than the figure shows. And I think war, I'm not quite sure where war is. It's down low likelihood, I think. But as we've seen in the Ukraine, low likelihood becomes high likelihood when you have madmen like Putin around. So yes, Brazil is quite lucky, has lots of water. So even though Brazil has lots of water nationally, it still suffers from severe regional droughts, which are getting worse. And this is a paper published in 2021, last year, in Nature, the world's most preeminent scientific journal, explaining, talking about the drought that Brazil experienced in 2021. It was showing that it needs a drought plan. The drought was made worse by climate change, deforestation, and intensive cattle farming. So deforestation, in order to produce more food, more lands for cattle, has knock-on effects for water balance across the country, and it needs a national solution. Even countries with lots of water, such as Ireland, may not have it in the right place. So we have lots of rainfall in Ireland, but most people in Ireland live on the east coast in Dublin, the capital city, and the city doesn't have enough water to supply it. So we now have a plan in Ireland to take water from the west coast via a huge pipeline to the capital city. And in red on the left-hand side of the diagram, Dublin will need an extra 330 million litres of water a day by 2050, based on population growth. So as people globally move to the cities, you need to move the water to the cities where maybe it isn't already. So again, another aspect of the global water crisis is the movement of peoples to cities. So I wanted to just, that was a little introduction. I want to now to two examples of water stressed countries to sort of show you the impact that's having on these areas. I'll also show you one example, which you may or you may not know about, of what we can call a water catastrophe. So the first example is Egypt. You know where Egypt is, on the north coast of North Africa. Perhaps what you don't know is water scarcity threatens to have a catastrophic impact on Egypt's agricultural output, soil quality, and water supply. It is thought by experts in the region that loss of water resources, flooding, and climate change may cause a decrease in wheat by 15% and maize by 90% by 2050. But Egypt is already heavily reliant on food imports and subsidies, so the loss of any food caused by lack of water will be catastrophic. And the last point is, between 1960 and 2020, within the lifetime of many people, Egypt's population grew from 27 million to over 100 million, leading per capita water supply to fall to 25% what it was. And it just shows you the scale of the problem facing Egypt, because the population is still growing. And all their water comes from, not all, 95% of its water comes from the Nile. And there's a map of an aerial photograph of Egypt. And the population is almost entirely confined and fed from waters of the Nile. And it's Egypt's bad luck to have a neighbor upstream on the Nile in Ethiopia, who is also determined to grow economically and become a military power, just like Egypt is. And Ethiopia is building the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam across one of the headwaters of the Nile, which may or may not remove water, take water away from the Nile. Now, I'm going to ignore all the writing on the left-hand side of the diagram, but it is fair to say that Egypt is very concerned about the potential impact on the Nile waters by the building of this dam. And it's a grave ongoing regional problem. And it is thought that possibly Egypt may even resort to military means to prevent the meeting. It is an area of great concern and ongoing discussion. So these dams being built may threaten the water downstream. Sorry, go back up. Secondly, Iran. We know a lot about Iran. It is perhaps a rather awkward country. It's building nuclear weapons, and it's the focus of much political global thought. What we perhaps don't know is it's also subject of extreme water shortages. They've been facing increasing water scarcity issues because of a 20-year drought and years of water mismanagement. 20 million people in the country have been forced to move to cities because the land is too dry for food. Just as Egypt, their population has grown dramatically since the revolution, and there's just not enough water to sustain those people on the land, so they flock to the cities. But then the government of Iran have prioritized in many areas the growth of industry so as to be self-sufficient in industry. And the growth of industry needs water, which has been taken from agriculture. So the last point there is growing civil unrest about the diversion of water away from agriculture towards thirsty industry. And the picture shows just a couple of years ago, or last year, I think, big protests in parts of Iran over the lack of water, threatening the stability of the country. And of course, the government then responds very severely by shooting a few of them. So it's not a very happy country right now. To give an example, here's the Zayanda Rud River in Iran. The Zayanda Rud is the life-giving river. It's the largest river on the central plateau of Iran and normally flows all year long. And this is a famous Islamic era bridge, medieval bridge over the Zayanda Rud, showing the size of the river. This is an aerial photograph of the river. It starts in the Zagros Mountains to the top left of the picture and winds its way down to an inland marsh. It doesn't go to the sea, it flows to an inland delta through the city of Isfahan on the right of the diagram. Unfortunately, in Isfahan, water has been diverted away from the Zayanda Rud towards a steel-making plant in the desert. And you can see there the steel-making plant, that large smoky plant in the top left of the diagram. And if you look carefully, you can see the Zayanda Rud River is blue, it's full of water up to a certain point, and then suddenly it stops. Basically, the government has taken the water away from the river and has diverted it towards the steel-making plant to prioritize steel over anything else. But the river's flows and the irrigated farmland have been drastically reduced to the extent now that the Zayanda Rud very rarely flows, I should say, through Isfahan. And it's been completely drying up during the summer seasons. So it's really a rather sad example, I think, of poor water management more than anything else. The same pattern has happened across much of the Middle East, where dry lands, people living in the dry lands have been forced to the cities by drought, by poor water management. And this movement to the cities, as the picture shows there, sets the stage for massive uprising. It happened in Syria in 2006, and it threatens to happen in other parts of the Middle East in the future. So it's not just a problem for these countries, it becomes a global or a regional problem for many of us. So on to my freshwater catastrophe, if this wasn't bad enough. Well, there you have a little map of Central Asia, and you can see the Caspian Sea. You might not know that, but there's the Aral Sea next to it, or there's the Aral Sea as was. So the Aral Sea in Central Asia is an inland freshwater sea. Until recently, it was the world's fourth largest inland body, a huge inland sea, but it has suffered from the over-abstraction of surface water for irrigated agriculture. Now, there's a lot of writing there. I'll read it quickly. In the 1960s, large dams were built across the two rivers flowing into the sea, and you can see those from the diagram, flowing from the bottom of the diagram into the Aral Sea. Because the Soviet Union wished to turn the dry steppe into irrigated cotton and rice fields to improve the quality of life and the production for people. They thought, well, let's take the water from the rivers. And 50 kilometers cubed per year of fresh water used to flow into the sea. But by the 1980s, it had fallen to virtually nothing. Any water flowing back into the lake or the sea was heavily salinized, that's salty, and contaminated by pesticides. And over the last 30 years, the Aral Sea has experienced a severe drop in water level and a great increase in salinity. It used to be famous for a fishery, but all 20 known fish species are now extinct. So it really is a catastrophe. This is what has been created instead of an inland sea. It's an irrigated steppe growing cotton and rice. So yes, the steppe is now productive, but the poor old Aral Sea has all but disappeared. So this shows the shrinking Aral Sea from 1960 to 2008. You can see over time, the lake the sea, I should say, has just shrunk away almost to nothing. So there's some aerial photographs now. This is what it was in 1989, 30 years. It was already a bit shrinking then, but 2003, 20 years ago, it was shrinking. There it is in 2017, very little left. And if you go to Google Earth, look now, it's virtually disappeared. So a whole inland sea has gone because of an arbitrary decision taken by a bunch of politicians in Moscow in the 1960s to grow cotton in the desert. And there you are, fishing boats sitting abandoned in what was a sea and is now a desert. So it's a dramatic example of how humans can change a sea into a desert. Extraordinary. Talk about cotton. I mean, when you wear a cotton shirt, or you eat a beef burger, or you drink a cup of coffee, you should think about how much water it took to produce these things. So this is what was called virtual water usage per unit of product. How much water goes to making 1 kilogram of coffee, for example? Well, it turns out we need 132 liters of water to make 125 milliliters cup of coffee. If you go down the diagram, you'll see it takes 8,000 liters to make a single pair of jeans. And it needs, anyway, you can follow the diagram. It takes a lot of water to produce these products. And I asked the question in the diagram there, how much virtual water is by happy families? So it's not just the water in the cup, it's all water that needs to produce all the food they're eating, particularly beef, chocolate, coffee, and cotton. So we need to think about these when we consume cotton t-shirts. And we do so in industrialized countries in huge numbers, 700 liters of water to make 1 cotton shirt, enough water for 1 person to drink for 2.5 years. And we're consuming more and more cotton clothes, what's called fast fashion. And now this is a growing issue, a growing concern, certainly in industrialized countries, how much we're consuming and how much virtual water we're consuming. When we buy our t-shirts and our cotton in clothes in Ireland, do we actually think of where the water came from? And has this resulted in the drying up of the Aral Sea? We don't think about it, of course. Groundwater, then, sources provide 50% of all water used for irrigation. And this is a very scary figure. 10% of the world's agricultural food production depends on unsustainable mined groundwater. That is to say, you're taking water out of the ground much faster than it is being put in the ground by rainfall. You're literally mining the world's water. So I read out again, 10% of the world's agricultural food production depends on unsustainable mined groundwater. Going forward, 10, 20, 40, 50 years, that groundwater will have gone and the food with it. So a large majority of the world's population lives in countries sourcing nearly all their staple crop imports from partners who deplete groundwater to produce these crops, highlighting risks for global food and water security. Some countries, such as the US, Mexico, Iran, and China, are particularly exposed to these risks because they produce food and import food irrigated from rapidly depleting aquifers. And this shows the global virtual water trade from a few years ago. And just look at Brazil, how much virtual water it is exporting to Europe and to Africa and to China. Huge quantities of virtual water in terms of crops, probably mostly in terms of beef and soybean. But that's dwarfed by the amount of water that the US exports in terms largely of wheat, probably and beef, particularly to China. 78 cubic kilometers of water exported from North Africa to China. The trouble is, it's producing food from aquifers that are running out of water. Notably, the Ogallala aquifer in the US. I don't know if you've heard about it, but the Great Plains of the United States, where they're producing so much of the world's wheat, is produced from water from the ground, not from rainfall, but from groundwater left there at the end of the Ice Age. So the Ogallala in the High Plains aquifer is being depleted at a rate of 12 billion cubic meters per year through over abstraction for irrigated crops. So if I go back to this diagram and you look at all the flow US to Europe and to China, that's a limited time to do that. It shows a picture of these great high plains in the USA, and you can see there's little circles here are green crops grown by irrigated water from the ground. And that little writing in red, 1/6 of the world's grain comes by depleting groundwater. One assumes that can't continue in the future. So where else will we get our food from? There's no answer to that yet. And just shows again the depletion of the groundwater in the US from 1900 to current days. So here's groundwater depletion, cubic kilometers, and it's going up and up and up. So we as a global population really we're getting our food from, and is it sustainable in terms of water? And the answer seems to be pretty much no. Just a couple of just an example here, a dramatic example of the consequences of over abstraction. I don't know if you've heard of Yemen, but there's been a war bubbling away in Yemen for several years now. Almost all important groundwater systems are being overexploited at alarming rates. Groundwater abstraction from aquifers near the capital, Sana'a, in Yemen, is 5 times higher than natural recharge, and the water level decline is 4 to, I'm just going to move my figure here, 4 to 8 meters per year. High quality water will be depleted within a few years. That creates huge stress for people, and those stressed peoples are more likely to get aggressive and to start to take up arms against an enemy. So this kind of water stress does tend to lead to conflict. So no water, no food, strife and conflict and war is one potential consequence of this groundwater depletion. And in fact, it's been now suggested that many of the world's conflict zones will be water conflict, because there just isn't enough water, isn't enough food. People move to the cities, they haven't got jobs, they haven't got money, and they're capitalized and becomes. So it's a long way from water to military warfare, but the link very much is there. Well, that's all very gloomy and bad, but how can practical solutions alleviate the water crisis? Because we can if we have the willpower and the money. I just want to go through a few little solutions that may be applied in parts of the world. And the first is rainwater harvesting. When it rains, a lot of the water simply runs off the land, down into a culvert or a river, and then into the sea. And if you can trap the water before it runs off onto the land, into the rivers, you can use it to enhance the productivity of the land. But you need to trap it and store it for some reason, in some manner. And you can do it either via micro catchment or a macro catchment. In a micro catchment, such techniques as rooftop and courtyard systems, the water that hits our roofs, that runs off in the gutters, is lost. If you can store that water in a tank nearby, you can use it down the line. It's very, very simple. It just needs a little bit of application and a bit of money spent, obviously. At a small scale, a single farmer can create these runoff basins that trap water as it's running off over land. Small amounts, but you can grow crops such as fruit trees in these runoff basins. And I will show you a picture of that in the next slide. At a larger level, a macro catchment, you can trap water flowing off the slopes of hillsides in a kind of terracing system, or what's called a jasur system. And I'll show you a picture of that as well. So in the dry lands, we can try to trap the water before it flows off the land. And here's an example of a little bund or a semicircular depression in the ground that is storing the rainwater before it runs off the land. It soaks into the soil and creates moist conditions for the growth of small plants. You're not going to get rich doing that, but at least it provides some food where before there wasn't any. And the other diagram shows the farmer creating a small depression in the soil, planting the plant in the depression, and that depression preferentially filled with water during rainfall. So he can concentrate the rain into small areas. Jesur is an ancient runoff water harvesting technique in North Africa. When it rains, the rainfall is stored in these terraces, which then soak into the ground, preventing it just running off and allowing the growth of trees and high quality crops in the terraces areas. And of course, those crops may produce agricultural produce that is quite profitable, so it can be sold as well as eaten. In a larger scale, you can recharge the groundwater from floodwater. What you need to do is collect the runoff from winter rains in a large drainage basin and direct it into what's called recharge ponds. This directs the water back into the ground. Now, it's not lost because you can then suck the water back out of the ground using pumps or wells. Okay, so storing it underwater is actually a very good idea because it doesn't evaporate under the ground and you can retrieve it later on. So we need to get the water out of the sort of flowing over the land into the ground as much as possible. And this is particularly practiced in Israel. So it shows a groundwater recharge basin in Israel. You can also put in water from towns and cities that is contaminated into the ground, where the ground will naturally filter it and clean it. Desalination is often thought to be a solution to water shortage. And yes, if you have the technology and the money and the energy and the infrastructure, you can desalinate large amounts of water, particularly in Israel. So modern desalination plants on Israel's Mediterranean coast can provide fresh water at a cost of less than 60 cents per 1,000 liters. Now, this is not a solution for arid countries that are inland, such as North India or Pakistan, but may provide solutions to smaller coastal arid countries, notably like Israel. It's an area of growing technology, and the cost of desalination is growing down. There are environmental downsides, what to do with the very heavy brine that produce, but nonetheless, it's of a growing interest to many countries. It's perhaps the only solution in some areas. And lastly, drip irrigation. Traditionally, irrigation has been practiced for many thousands of years by flooding the field with water, but that has a big problem. A lot of the water then evaporates, and as it evaporates, it brings salts to the surface. So you lose water and you get a salty soil, what's called salinized soil. Drip irrigation is a way of avoiding that, where if you have the technology and the infrastructure, you can put water, instead of flooding the field, you can put water down a pipe where it'll drip onto individual plants. And the invention and introduction of drip irrigation in Israel during the 1960s was the most important innovation behind the increase in agricultural yields despite reduced water supply. So even though there's less water than there was, Israel is still producing many high-value crops using very, very clever irrigation techniques. And you can see in the second paragraph, the paramount challenge in irrigation is to control the salinity that accumulates in plants and water, but leave the salt behind. By decreasing overall water delivery, drip irrigation reduces residual salts. So it's a way of saving water and reducing salts. Okay, I'll summarize now because I've been talking far too long probably. And it's not a very happy picture. So first of all, millions of people are now facing severe water and food shortages in the world's drylands in coming decades. We know that. Secondly, the global abstraction of groundwater for irrigation of crops is unsustainable and will lead to reduced global food supply and higher food prices in coming decades. That's inevitable. Thirdly, it looks like water shortages will lead to more wars and conflict in the future, especially, and I apologize for my spelling mistake, especially in the Middle East and Asia. So these wars are not because you have arrogant dictators or there's something wrong with the politics or whatever else, or religion. Water shortages probably underlie most of these these wars. And of course, we've been hearing so much over the recent decade, climate change and mismanagement of scarce water shortages will make this problem worse. So it's not a pretty picture, but we'll end up on a bit of optimism. Is number 5, there are solutions, but the conservation needs to be given much greater global priority. And I shall end my lecture there on showing what you can do at UCC. Hopefully I've interested you in one area for the future. And it's the old people live in the old ways. They take it for granted there will be water, or they take it for granted there isn't water. But the young generation need urgently to find solutions to these. So this is where education comes in. And in UCC, we have a unique program that allows students to sample a wide range of material before choosing their degree and career path. So you come into year 1, and there in the circles are all the different modules that you take in the year 1, and then we can take a variety of pathways after that. As you can see, there's different degrees. We have ecology, environmental science, international field, geosciences, science education. I won't read them out, but we have a whole list of them there. And the course structure can be read on the you can see the website down below. I shall end you there and pass you back to Marina or Sarah. And perhaps you could stop my screen. I'll stop my sharing now. And I'm willing to take any questions you have at all.
Thank you, Simon. That was very interesting and very depressing. I will never buy new clothes or drink coffee or anything else again. But really, really interesting, fascinating class.
Yes, I'm sorry to be gloomy, but there's no point in being falsely optimistic about these things. You know, we all say, oh, isn't it great? And there's all these wonderful things to do. But, you know, we're talking so much about the climate crisis that I think we're in danger of ignoring or forgetting the water crisis. And unless we know about it, we're always going to be surprised. Why are they having another war in Iran or Syria? Why is the price of food going up? I don't understand it. Well, it's because there's no water. So to be informed is at least to be forearmed, I think.
Absolutely. And I suppose it's interesting how we, as we said at the start, we hear a lot about climate change, but we hear very little in the media or in public discourse about water shortages. And I think, I suppose, for our students that are watching this evening, I suppose it's an interesting area. It's an area that there will be lots of work in as societies look for innovative solutions to these very real problems.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, I mean, technological solutions are very much part of the solution, and we have to take greater cognizance of this.
Does anybody there have any questions that they would like to ask, either in English or in Portuguese?
E aí, gente, alguma pergunta?
Uma pergunta, um comentário? Todo mundo está tímida? Se alguém quer escrever no comentário?
Tem alguém com o microfone aberto, não sei se vai falar ou não.
Like in Ireland, the students are very shy, are they?
Yeah.
Sometimes, yeah.
Sometimes
it's difficult to ask a question
when you're online. To us after the class ends.
Yeah.
Like, oh, it was really nice. I would like to know more about it. I'm like,
okay.
They're really shy. So it was a very interesting class. I think we don't realize how water connects us to everything, you know.
Yeah, that's true. Every time you export
what we eat, not just what we eat, but what we're using, everything we produce turns back into water.
Yeah, that's true.
And
Yeah.
how it affects our consumption in general, and how the way we live is ruining the planet, which is really, really sad.
But there's still
Yeah,
time.
there needs to be a global agreement on water trading. I didn't go into great detail about this, but countries that have abundant water can grow crops or produce that need lots of water, like beef or dairy or fruit. And countries that don't have much water should not grow those products, but they should grow products that consume much less water. And they should trade high water for low water, high produce for high value for low value. One of the pictures I had in another lecture was of huge areas of irrigated desert in Saudi Arabia for dairy farms producing milk. But why would you produce milk in Saudi Arabia? It makes no sense whatsoever. So we have to sort of produce the crops that are suitable to the area rather than trying to produce crops that need too much water because it's high value. So this kind of global water trading needs to be thought about much more carefully. I can foresee a time in the near future where a huge tanker moors off the coast of Western Ireland, perhaps in Limerick, sucks up water from the Shannon River and steams round to somewhere like Barcelona or Cape Town in South Africa, sells our water. I can quite foresee that, or sails all the way around through the Red Sea to the coast of Iran. We deliver water and they send us their oil. We trade water for oil. I think this will happen. It sounds crazy, but I think it will happen. Water's, you cannot live without water, but you can live without oil. A bit.
A bit. Very good. Nobody has any questions? Ninguém tem pergunta, comentário? Não? Tudo bem, tudo bem.
Falem, a Sara fala em português.
Mas se alguém quer mais informações, a gente vai compartilhar os slides do professor Harrison depois. Se alguém tem algumas dúvidas ou quer saber mais sobre o UCC, como universidade que tem muitos prêmios internacionais, prêmios no país da Irlanda também, a gente está recebendo números crescendo de brasileiros que estão indo lá estudando, fazendo PhD, fazendo pesquisas. Tem muita oportunidade, inclusive esse curso que o professor mencionou, que é um curso muito inovador, porque se você gosta desse tipo de área, mas não tem certeza onde você quer levar a sua carreira, esse tipo de coisa é uma boa opção, porque você pode fazer vários módulos no primeiro ano e já a partir do segundo ano se escolher qual tipo de graduação, qual tipo de carreira você quer seguir. Nessa área, nesse curso, é uma coisa super importante que eu quero compartilhar com vocês. Se você tem uma nota boa, você tem notas boas, média boa, você vai ganhar uma bolsa. Essa bolsa é 25% em todos os anos da sua jornada universitária. Então, vai depender de mérito, vai depender das suas notas. Se você está estudando ainda, presta muita atenção nas suas notas, porque sua nota vale ouro mesmo, vocês já sabem disso, né? Enfim, se vocês querem conversar mais, entre em contato com a Efígie, eles colocam vocês em contato com a gente, e será um grande prazer conversar com vocês, e espero um dia receber vocês em Cork, na Irlanda.
Isso aí, gente, é um curso interessantíssimo, nós precisamos desses profissionais, né? Como a Sara já disse, contem com a gente. I would like to thank you, Professor Simon, thank you so much for your time, for sharing with us all your knowledge. And, pessoal, só um recadinho. Vocês lembram da Melka? A Melka estava com vocês ano passado aqui nas mocks e tudo mais. Ela aparece de vez em quando no nosso Instagram. A Melka está no Canadá. E vocês têm que ficar de olho, porque vamos postar várias coisinhas dela lá, para vocês conhecerem alguns lugares e tudo mais. Fazer um tourzinho com ela, tá bom? So, thank you so much, Professor Harrison, once again.
Thank you very much indeed, Marina.
Thank you.
And you've recorded my meeting. If you wish me to send the slides, I will quite happily.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes, please. Okay.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you very
Good
much.
evening. And
Bye-bye.
have a nice day in
Boa
Brazil.
tarde. Tchau, tchau.
Good evening.
See you, Sarah.
Tchau,
Cheerio.
Sara. Muito obrigada.
Tchau.
Um beijo. Tchau, tchau.
Beijo.